Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Calvin Symposium on Worship and this recorded video panel discussion on multiple pathways for youth. A conversation on how offering multiple pathways for youth to engage and take leadership in worship and church life also serves to bless and encourage all of us in the worshiping community, including those who live on the margins. My name is Kristen Verhulst, and I'm an Associate Director at the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. And it is an honor and a delight for me to host this conversation with my friends and colleagues, Bo Lim from Seattle Pacific University on the West Coast, Emmett Price of Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary on the East Coast, and Sandra Van Opstal of Chasing Justice and Grace and Peace Church in Chicago. In just a moment, I'm going to ask each one of my guests to introduce themselves, but I want to share with you just a couple of resources that guided me in my own preparation for this conversation. First of all, I read the book Parable of the Brown Girl, The Sacred Lives of Girls of Color, which came out earlier in 2020. And I was delighted then to interview the author, Christy Lauren Adams, for a podcast that we did for the Symposium on Worship. So I invite you to listen to that interview, and there's a link on the webpage. And then I also read an article from the Worship Institute website. It was a set of interviews with pastoral leaders from the Latinx church. It was called Lessons on Developing Young Leaders, Work Towards Shifting Perspectives and Implementing Change-Sustaining Practices. So I invite you to check out that resource as well. So Bo, Emmett, Sandra, thanks so much for joining me in this conversation. I would like you to each introduce yourself, and then would you please reflect on the past 10 years of your ministry work? What has been key for you in adapting your perspective about multiple pathways for youth in the life of the church? Bo, could we begin with you?
Sure. I'm delighted to be with you all. My name is Bo Lim. I'm currently a professor of Old Testament at Seattle Pacific University, where I've been teaching since 2006. But in my life there, I've also served as university chaplain for 4 years, from 2014 through 18. So I'll be reflecting upon my experiences both as professor and chaplain working with young people. In regard to my reflections in the past 10 years, let me just share some things I've learned. One, the key to working with youth is to have ongoing relationships with youth. Please don't just read books about youth. The info will be outdated by the time the book hits the publisher. Youth culture just changes so rapidly. Why? Due to technology. So rather than view, for those of us who are working with youth, don't just view them as this target outreach group. Have them as a part of your lives, a part of your community, a part of your congregations, a part of your conversations. And note this, that youth culture will be adult culture. And I don't just mean that they'll grow up and be the adults in your congregations, in your communities, but let's just look at how the influence of youth culture in our culture at large. And if you just even look at worship practices, what was youth worship practices have now become mainstream. So, I just shared an example. I remember, just chatting and hanging out with, that one of the best jobs as chaplain was just to hang out with the students. And I remember, one time I was sharing with them, what kids are doing these days, and this is what I'm observing from my kids. I said, they're buying and selling used clothes online, and I just remember one student just laughed at me, and she's like, you sound like my grandfather. And I was like, oh no, it's one thing to sound like her dad, but to be like sound like her grandfather, kids these days. And I just remember just letting her laugh at me and not being the authority, the judge in the room. And I'll say this, I now buy used clothes and sell used clothes online. So there's something that we can learn. And I'll just end with that right now.
Thanks, Bo. Emmett?
Well, thank you, Kristen. It's wonderful to be here with you and with Bo and Sandra. I am at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, where I've been since 2016. And from 2016 to 2020, I was the dean of the chapel for the Hamilton campus. Prior to my time at Gordon Conwell, and I served there as a professor of worship, church, and culture. I was a music professor and a professor of African American studies for 15 years at Northeastern University in Boston. And one of my main research topics, in addition to the music of the African diaspora and music of Black Americans, was hip hop culture. And so for many years, I would hang out with young people in the clubs, hang out with young people in the ciphers and street corners, and just participate in, a very urban based, but not urban only culture. And I'm also a church planner, and our church in January of 2021 will turn 9 years old. So almost for the last decade, I've been both in academia, both in the parish, but also on the street. And one of the things that to me is critical is the understanding of what it means to belong, what it means to belong, and to invite the same way that Jesus invited all of us into the church, such that we would have a place to belong, to see ourselves as vital, vibrant members of something that's bigger than us. And when we think about belonging, oftentimes it's an understanding of both a prophetic and a visionary sense, because where we will belong in the church or in a place, nobody sits in that seat right now. And so we have to get away from replacing seats and replacing, positions and functions and roles. And as we invite folks, particularly young people, they need to see themselves, and we need to catch a glimpse of them in terms of what they see, rather than us superimposing what we see. And so the whole notion of shepherding and journeying alongside, where one can actually hear from Jesus and hear from the Holy Spirit, and we can walk in affirmation and confirmation of that. And so I think we need to get away from such the patronizing, particularly for our young girls, the misogynistic, nomenclature that we use, and allow our young people to be vibrant members of a space where not only they belong, but we belong together.
Thanks. Sandra.
Yeah, well, it's great to be here with you all. Sad not to be in person, anticipating some kind of storm coming through Grand Rapids, but glad to nonetheless be learning together and continuing connections with one another. I'm coming at you from the west side of Chicago here this is not a sound studio. I'm hiding in my bedroom from my 2 6-year-olds. So I'm the co-founder and executive director of a movement called Chasing Justice, which is a movement led by folks of color to try to help guide young people basically into the discipline of and the journey of and the adventure of living justly. So the idea is that Chasing Justice as a community is going to be your guide. And so the team is made up of folks between the ages of 18 and my age, which I won't tell you, as the oldest person there. And really it's trying to answer the question of how do we deeply continue to love Jesus and follow Jesus and do justice in the world around us, which is a mark of, I think, every generation at that age, like every generation between the ages of 18, I think, and 24 wants to do that. I think this generation has marked it very differently and very nuanced. And so we're excited to be a part of that journey. And many on our team are actually in that journey. And I would say, a couple of the things, the first things that I thought of when I thought of the question that you asked were there are three kinds of ways I think that I wanted to, and other people I think wanted to be involved and want to be involved as young folks in the church. And those three ways are finding a place to be relevant and use your gifts, so serving, finding a place to be connected, so belonging, what Brother Price said earlier, like just belonging, knowing that you're liked, not just that you're respected or needed, but that you're actually liked and that people want to connect with you. And then a place where they can be invested into. And so I think all of those layers need to be there for, in particular, this generation that doesn't just want to belong. I think they want to do something. They want to make a difference. The data is out. They want to make a difference in the world. And yet they also feel like they're not seen. And so they are asking for people to coach them and guide them through becoming these types of influencers they imagine they can be. And so I think those three spaces is what we're always kind of aiming for and pivoting for, especially as we find ourselves as a church these days in a very different situation. So places where we can help young people discover their God-given gifts and perspectives, kind of nuanced perspectives, places where they can feel connected and relationally, and I think in particular intergenerationally connected. And then the third one is having a place where they're invested into, and people take them seriously enough to come alongside of them and see them and identify the things that they would need to also grow in and expand. So those are the three things I think of. I have been working with college students since 1996 in some capacity as a campus pastor with a parachurch ministry, as an urban project director in the mission kind of compassion justice world, and over the last 7 years as a executive pastor and preaching pastor in an urban church. So in all of those cases, I interacted with basically emerging leaders in academia, in kind of the service and missions, movement, and then also in the local church.
Wonderful, thank you. I love this idea of journeying together intergenerationally and alongside of the youth, and even this idea of we're all doing identity formation, but especially right in the adolescence shift into emerging adulthood, it's all about figuring out who I am. And so how much better to do that as a community of believers. So as you reflect on the youth you have worked with over the years, what pathways or practices worked well in your communities? And which ones did the youth resist or discard? And also too, how did the overall community, so the intergenerational community, respond to these different pathways? Bo, should we go back to you? Okay.
And again, I'll reflect about my time as chaplain. And for those of us, for those of you viewing this in Christian higher ed, you may relate to me, but I think my comments will also resonate with pastors. So I think the dynamics perhaps are they're similar to congregation. And so I'm going to describe some things that we've been doing at SPU, and I think it will resonate with you in local parishes. So at SPU, this is always a big discussion among Christian colleges. Do you have mandatory chapel or not? Okay, so we don't. Okay, we don't. You do have to take 3 theology classes, so that's the only mandatory sort of explicit Christian requirement. So here as chaplain, I'm in charge of university ministries, which at SPU includes both our sort of ministries on campus as well as our ministries of engagement off campus. And here's the deal: we can't expect them to show up. Right? That right there provides a particular kind of dynamic. If it's a mandatory chapel, you already have sort of a ready-made audience, an easy way to influence, whether they'll listen to you or not, or so forth. But you don't have to interest them in some regard. And in terms of us and how we're different than maybe some other Christian colleges, we're not in a like a small college town where there aren't other sort of options out there. There's plenty for students to engage in Seattle. And so we have to be missionally minded. We have to go where they are at. We just simply can't set an agenda and build a big baseball field and just expect them to show up. And so it's not going to happen in one big gathering. So here are the shifts and the transitions and the practices, that I started doing during my time as chaplain, has continued on with our current chaplain, is, we need to, seek smaller settings, different kinds of gatherings, perhaps use video and media even, and this is before COVID, right? And I would go to where students are at, right? Are they hanging out on the field? And that's where you hang out, right? If they're into sports or biking, that's what you do, right? And one of the best events that would happen each quarter or so is something that's called the multi-ethnic worship night, and that was actually I had nothing to do with it. Right? It was one of the best things, and I would go not to sort of control it. I would just go to participate, and they would be thrilled that I would show up. And sometimes afterwards, like I'd say, hey, come and join us here in some of our gatherings, and let me share how some of these changes were received. Some, and let me add to this, some of the changes were, we are not reaching everybody. We're not. And so and there were reasons why our campus did not allow other groups on campus for some time, and I won't get into that, but that was a standing practice. I said, this is silly. Let's partner with other ministries. We're clearly not reaching everybody. And so, we had Asian American Christian Fellowship, Young Life, InterVarsity, local churches. We now host a Catholic Mass. And many of these groups were the result of student connections to these groups. And when I did this was some of the reaction. Bo, why are you giving away home field? Right? That is our ability to influence our students. Or some, when I suggested let's stream our services, and again, and some said, well, you're giving up. We've given up. And my response is that, I care that we are reaching students for Christ, whether we carry the SPU brand or not, right? And these groups, still need to have approval, right? So that we can make sure that they share our values and so forth. But just acknowledging that Christ is at work in the world. And so we as institutions and organizations and leadership need to go out and partner with the ways in which Christ is already working in the world.
Thanks so much, Bo. Emmett?
Yeah, I'd like to answer this question maybe two ways. One is as a pastor in the city of Boston. And then the second way is as the executive director for an institute at the Institute for the Study of the Black Christian Experience at Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary, where we have a project called Equip, Nurturing Strong and Courageous Youth. As a pastor in the city of Boston, the last 4 years have been extremely difficult for our young people. Relative to the age that they are, they emerged in a world where they became conscious of the embodiment of their experience with a Black or a biracial president in the White House, with a tone, a posture, and a conversation, a national conversation that spoke in a way where they saw themselves as being empowered, even if there was an opposition that was growing. The last 4 years, again, the young people who I serve and see have wondered, what planet are they on? because the tone and the posture and the conversation has dramatically and diametrically changed in a way where they feel and they embody a sense of hatred that is upon them, that is coming from the nation. And so that impacts young people. I often say that young people have a third nostril and they're able to smell BS. And it's hard to attempt to share the gospel when the church is fractured within the United States of America, where you have prominent pastors and clergy folks who are espousing things that seem to be akin more to nationalism and patriotism than biblicism and evangelism. And so in that sense, young people have a really interesting challenge in terms of how they perceive the kingdom of God, how they perceive the local church, how they perceive me or any other person as a pastor. That's been a challenge. It's been a huge challenge because in many ways, these young people actually know the Bible better than some of us, because their sense of curiosity and inquisitiveness takes them to either Mama Google or Daddy Wikipedia, where they ask, Mama Google or Daddy Wikipedia the questions that they want to know. And they end up finding scripture, and they end up finding theology, and they end up finding things that many of us are not walking in. And they are ready and able to challenge us. Even many of us who have gone to seminary, they are ready and willing to challenge us. And I'm excited about that. But it's also a challenge. From the seminary perspective and from our project of Equip, we found that many of the young people, and we partner with Afro-diasporic churches from first, second, third generation Nigerian, Ghanaian churches, Cape Verdean churches, Haitian, Jamaican churches, Afro-Latinx churches, Peruvian, Colombia, Puerto Rican. And what we find is a very similar thing. And this is this: that young people want to come to a working knowledge of Christ, want to be in relationship with God, but their response is often as Mahatma Gandhi's response to Howard Thurman. When Howard Thurman and Mahatma Gandhi had a meeting, and Mahatma Gandhi said, Howard, I really like your Jesus, but you Christians, ugh. And that's how the young people are that we find across the diaspora, right? Because there's such hypocrisy in the conversation, at least in the Church of Jesus Christ. Let me say Boston, because I can't speak for the entire nation. And that's something that we need to work on and improve. And not for the sake of just the church, but for the sake of modeling a divinely inspired hope and a message of love that I believe that Jesus walked in the earth with.
Thank you. Sandra.
Yeah, I'd like to build on a couple of things my brothers have already added. Since I'm last, I won't repeat things. I'll try to think about, my journey here, but I agree and amen everything they said. So I'm not in disagreement at all. I think that for me, as I think about the question, it's the first thing is context matters. So I don't know what young people, which young people, what's young, 18 to 24, 24 to 35. What's young? And also where, young people where, in what space and place. And because I know that the symposium is global, the question is young people in what country, young people in what socioeconomic location, young people in which ecclesial tradition, so it's which young people. So I want to speak specifically about my own space. But first I want to say that there is recent research that's been done on the breadth of quote unquote young people. Barna did a fantastic study, the Barna group, studying 15,000 adults ages 18 through 30-ish in 25 countries in different languages. And I think some of the themes that we're talking about right now are mentioned in that study. So I want to name them just so that we have a reference point. But the first theme that they came up with, and I actually went last winter, I was all over Latin America talking about these themes because I could get the country report of each of those countries and tell them this is true for you too. This is globally true in every location of young people in any socioeconomic situation. They feel alone. They are more connected than ever before, and yet they feel so alone. They don't feel seen by anyone. And so I think we have to wrestle with what are we doing in our practices that actually let people be seen. The second one is they're spiritually open. They're actually super open to having spiritual conversations and like Emmett said, debates about theology. And I think that there's such a healthy exchange when there's younger eyes. It's kind of like when you have a person in your Bible study who's like not even like remotely interested in faith, but they like your coffee, so they come and they ask the most interesting questions, And so I think that spiritual openness is a blessing, not just to them, but to the church itself. They're growing up the third one is growing up in an age of anxiety. So imagine you're an 18-year-old young Latina woman growing up in our country, and since you were 13 years old, all you've seen is your community attacked in every kind of way. I mean, at every level, no matter what policy, and you're thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, I'm so anxious. What about my family? What about my cousins? What about my community? What about my church? So I think that level of anxiety, it's there for everyone. And they're looking for answers. So they're gonna go to Wikipedia and Google and YouTube to find out things about the world. Because they want answers. They want answers specifically to why there's so much suffering and so much conflict in our world. And then the fifth one is that they're looking for resilient discipleship. They're really looking for someone who encourages them to grow spiritually. So they're open and they want to be taught. They want to be guided, but they want to be guided in looking for answers, in addressing their anxiety and understanding that they're, kind of being seen. And then lastly, they long to make a difference. And that study gives you like really concrete answers about both the breadth of that reality and then in each specific space, how it works out. But I think to me, that has been when they came out with that survey, I'm telling you, Kristen, I was like, oh my gosh, finally somebody gave me the data to like go along with the thing that all three of us probably knew, like all because we were with students. So we're sitting with them, we're watching them grow up in this, and the reality is we're anxious too. We're scared too. We're connected but very alone too. And this pandemic has only made things worse. And so I think that for me as a practitioner and a pastor and an activist, and as an intuitive healer, I think I could have probably told you all 6 of those things, but I'm so thankful for research and data that says absolutely, and not just white kids or not just Black kids or not just Latino kids or Asian kids. It's actually all of our children, all of our young people across the world are living in a different reality. And so I would say the first thing people need to think about if you're going to create something, you're going to have to understand that context matters, and that you're looking to answer the questions. So if they're longing for answers, the question is what questions, what answers are the kids in your particular space longing for? Are the youth and young adults and young professionals longing for in your particular space? And then the second thing that Bo said I thought was so brilliant, I totally see right now, is things they plan on their own is what works. So I mean, it just should make sense to us as leaders anyway. It's like people have buy-in. So I'm thinking one very specific thing. So for Chasing Justice, we're trying to, it's not that we're trying to come out with curriculum. We're almost trying to like curate and sift through all the information that is out there on the interwebs and on the socials. So we'll kind of repost things, ask questions, engage an article that might come out, but I don't think our role really is to create more content. I really feel it's in the very true sense to guide people through all of the information they're getting. And so we wanted to do these short little things around voting, like just the importance of voting, particularly because it's aimed at young people of color. So this is why it's important that we vote. So they just took their own like phones and made their own cameras and said whatever they wanted. And that's what got the most follows of anything we did, because it was them creating it. They know what their peers want. And then one of the young women on our team, she's an artist. She's brilliant. Her name's Jocelyn Chung. You should follow her on Instagram. So she does like lettering, graphic lettering. And so she's also very interested in being socially engaged. So she put just a thing on her Instagram, it's a really beautiful lettered thing that says like, find out about the propositions, like the props that are happening in California. If you want to come, register at this Zoom thing. And she had over 100 of her peers register for an impromptu last minute Zoom conversation on the propositions that were coming in California. And I was like, we worked so hard for 3 weeks to get like 80 people to come to an event. And you're like, hey, want to talk to me? I'm 25, and what she did was she actually just asked her friends who are also in her same age group, but have expertise in this area, to talk about education or whatever, kind of the propositions that were affecting education and housing. And I asked her how it was, and she said it was so fantastic. And then I realized, I don't know, I was trying to figure out, like, do we try to get them to do stuff like that for Chasing Justice? Do we just let them do it on their own just kind of somehow encourage that on their own platforms, but connect to it and enhance it? Or I don't even know what to do with them anymore. So I would say that not only letting, kind of like what works is what they do on their own, but the question I think we're having to ask as folks in our, 40s plus is, what does it look like to come alongside of that and coach it? Because there are things that are done that I'm like, you can't, like they posted something and I was like, you can't put that on a nonprofit. Like I could put it on my Instagram and I will, but Chasing Justice is organizationally, you have to, there's just things you have to consider. And so I don't know if that makes sense, but it's like, how do we coach and support things, but actually do less of this, like, let's do this thing for our young people. They're literally laughing at us. They're like, what are you doing for me? I'm not going. So I don't know if that makes sense. But that's the thing I'm learning right now.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I do hear us saying it's so important to listen, right? To listen to our young people, to emerging adults, and really allow them to share their own stories and make room in all kinds of ways, including, let their ideas guide us sometimes, and that might prove to be very fruitful. So we've already hinted at this idea of mentorship. You used the word coaching, Sandra. So tell us a little bit more, our audience, your own experience with mentorship or walking alongside youth. Both did the youth find it empowering and encouraging, but even yourself, what was the experience for you personally as you did this mentoring? And what were some of the opportunities that it brought, but also some of the challenges that you have found in the whole mentorship pathway? So Bo, I'm going to go right back to you.
Okay. And here, let me actually, comment too of something Emmett shared of the suspicion, right? The suspicion that young people have of authority figures. And I think both Sandra and Emmett have articulated the reasons why they are suspicious. So here's, as someone who works with young people, whether I'm a pastor, chaplain, professor, I expect them to be suspicious. I am not offended. I don't take it personally. They should be, and particularly students of color, particularly students who've been marginalized. I mean, they should be. And so here, I need to get over that. And I will say this, I've seen some colleagues of mine unable to do so and be incredibly effective. And And I'll say this, these are oftentimes white male colleagues in the latter years of their career, feeling like they're irrelevant and so forth. And I personally feel for them, okay? But I have to say, you got to get over your fragility. I'm sorry. If you want to work with young people, I'm sorry, we got to get over our fragility. And if we can't do so, then maybe we shouldn't work with young people. I'm just saying, in this climate with these particular students. So we have to do some work with our own souls. So let me say that, right? We in our current day, we have to do some work with our own souls. And I mean, I could say, let me say, the closer I work with young people, the more challenge and angst. And so and so let me share a little bit of just my experience. You asked me to share some of my experience walking alongside students. And so I will say this, a professor's life is more of a cushy gig, if you will. You have a lot more control. Right? You're the authority. Right? Working in student life, which is typically where university ministries is located in university, it is co-curricular, right? So like I mentioned before, students it's mandatory for them to take my classes. Co-curricular, it's optional, right? And I learned a lot from my student life staff because they walk alongside students. And here's the challenge now, when you do so, right? At times, it will put you in places, in odd spaces. You want to be an advocate for them. At times, though, you may be in places, though, where you are balancing things. While I was chaplain, that we experienced, and we continue to experience, so part was the election of Donald Trump, but even prior to that, there was a national phenomenon across our country where there was, protests at universities where Black student unions were making demands. Many presidents resigned during that period of time, and same thing happened with us. There were online petitions that were circulated by students. And I'm not saying this is bad stuff. I'm just saying this is stuff, right? This is stuff. And there were protests, and these were in regard to issues of diversity, racial justice. Later on, there were some protests and in regard to policies of sexual ethics. And here, it was a learning experience for me now to be in the role of being advocate, right? And it's a tough place to stand, like I mentioned before, because you typically maybe perhaps are, at the end of the day, if the institution, blows up, I don't care. But if you stand for the values, okay, if you stand for the values with the mission of the institution, then that's the balancing act. And I just say, if you don't want to, if you want a cushy gig, then don't work with them. But if you want to work at this place where God is working, right? And I know I'm articulating much of the challenge, but there are beautiful, beautiful moments, and there were tears of struggle. There are tears of joy too, right? That's that place in a really profound way. I know all ministry carries that, right? But particularly given our cultural climate, I think in very particular ways with young people.
Thank you. Emmett?
I see mentoring or coaching or shepherding or guiding or sherping, I see that as a form of stewardship. And the way that I think about stewardship is with 5 T's. And the first T is time. It takes time, and you have to avail time. And then the second T is talent, that you end up having to utilize the talent that God has invested in you to be able to nurture and to care for the folks who are in your presence. And then the third is temple, your body, your embodied. You need to put your body on the line for these folks. You need to be in physical presence and proximity with them. The fourth T is trust, something that we assume. Bo just talked about a suspicion. We need to earn their trust before we have the right to call ourselves a mentor or a coach or whatever it is. And then the fifth T is treasure. It's going to cost you something. And sometimes it'll cost you money, an occasional lunch, an occasional this, occasional that. And so I see it that way. The fruit of this, though, is that when we avail our stewardship and we avail ourselves in a very vulnerable, transparent, and honest way, then you're creating lifelong bonds. And the investment in a lifelong relationship bears fruit upon fruit upon fruit upon fruit. I mean, I'm at a place now, and I've been able to mentor quite a number of young people through a number of programs, some that I run, some that I participated in. But one of the programs that I've run for the last decade is the James Abington Church Music Academy through the Hampton Ministers Conference. And over the last decade, there have been so many young people who have come through that and who have manifested now. Some of them are my colleagues. They've earned PhDs and are professors at phenomenal places. Some of them are recording artists. Some of them are leading minister of music of large, churches and whatnot. And the beautiful thing is to be able to have one who came in early and then put one of my younger folks in touch with them to create an intergenerational sense, right? And that sense of loyalty, but also that sense of investment. Because my phone, and I have two sons, they're 17 and 15. And the joke in the house is we can be sitting at dinner and my phone will ring and my two boys, they'll start cracking up. And, the joke is, somebody's calling dad, somebody needs dad. So let's see what he's going to do. Is he going to eat dinner or is he going to excuse himself from the table and go? And so I've even been able to, automatic text one of my, folks from the earlier years to move in on a situation so that I can sit at the dinner table and laugh back at my two sons because I didn't get up. Right. And so, the beautiful thing about these relationships that become familial, they become, sincere. If I think about some of the young people who I've pastored, 10, 12, 15 years ago, who have gone through college and who, send me notes and, requests to marry them as they have found significant, others, or, the first child is born and they want me to be present to do the christening or a naming ceremony, depending on nationality and where we are in the country or in the world. And so it's just a beautiful thing. It's an investment, though. It's a huge investment. And I think folks who are not called into this space should probably humble themselves, because I don't think it's for everybody. And there are a lot of things that I know that is not for me that I stay away from. And so I think it's one of these things that it's really a call. I think the last thing that I'll say is that I believe that remembering is a spiritual discipline. And Sandra said this earlier, but we need to remember what it was like when we were young too. And the things that did work for us and the things that didn't work for us. A lot of our young people now are introverts. I remember being in a youth group, and our youth group director used Socratic method. I mean, will call you by the name and ask you, what did you think about something? And, I'd end up stuttering because I just wasn't necessarily an external processor at that time. And I was embarrassed, being a teenager, you didn't formulate full ideas yet, and you kind of spew stuff out and everyone's snickering and laughing. And, the person who you may have been attracted to is now Google eyeing you, trying to figure out, are you smart or not? I mean, all these things play into it. And so, in many ways, I choose not to do the things that I didn't appreciate when I was young. And I also choose to have the authority to do the things that I wish somebody had done for me when I was young. And so I think remembrance is a spiritual discipline. I think it's something that we need to practice and practice and practice and really take ownership of, because it allows us to have good posture, to have good tone, and really good alignment.
Thank you, Emmett. Sandra?
One of the opportunities and challenges, both, I would say it as an opportunity and challenge in walking alongside of youth, particularly in that stage where they are really asking, who am I? What is my identity? How do others see me? Is to really understand our need for cultural intelligence, and understanding how when you're mentoring cross-culturally, you have to really pay attention, because mentoring cross-culturally without cultural intelligence could actually be dangerous. And I would say that it was for me personally. Most of my mentors in life were not women of color. They were white men, because the particular field I was going into was dominated by white men. And so they occupied the positions of authority that I was seeing. I want to be a preacher someday. I want to be a pastor someday. I want to be a community leader someday. And I think that I spent my first part of my leadership years feeling like if I was more like this, if I acted like this, if I sounded like this, if I behaved like this. And they definitely didn't have cultural intelligence, so they didn't understand some of what they were asking of me was not actually just leadership principles. There was a particular contextualized leadership. So, and I know there's been a lot of work done around that. And so, they say, like, if 90% of what we know about leadership is cultural and 10% of it is actually principled or universal, then imagine that all of our leadership books in a seminary setting and an academic setting are written by white men. Then came like a wave of Asian American men who mentored me theologically. They were all NTs on the Myers-Briggs. They were definitely conceptual thinkers. I'm an intuitive feeler. So here we had like this kind of like explosive Argentine, Colombian, Latina, intuitive feeler, activist, revolutionary, and all my mentors were like, just subtle subversive change over time. And I was like, nah, I'm about to throw the tables up in this place. And then a wave of African-American women who mentored me in leadership and preaching. But I literally had one mentor from my own community until I was already into my 30s. And that was it slowed me down, y'all. It slowed me down because nobody thought to ask, I wonder what it looks like for Sandra to grow into her leadership and into her activism in a way that makes sense in her cultural way. And so I feel like I was trying to be everybody else before I could be myself. So I would say that mentoring challenge, most of the young people that I mentored in my early years of ministry, 3/4 of them were Asian American. And I must have made a million mistakes, but boy, did I read books. I read dozens of books. I was mentored. I was coached. I was corrected. I was penalized, and so I think that I hope that in my desire to love them and encourage them, that I would have learned things like what power distance looks like in a Korean American culture is different than what it looks like in a Colombian family, and how do we account for those things. So I think that I would say that's something that's incredibly needed, particularly since as you look at the demographics of this next generation, they're overwhelmingly going to be brown, and I would say the Latina community that's growing the most is actually the most unknown, because there's not as much written for us in a Christian space, interestingly enough. But we occupy so much of the church, the research questions have not been asked. And so I feel like we either have to fit in somebody else's narrative. So I think that you don't have to be a rocket scientist. Like, I'm sure I just said I'm sorry like a million times in my early years, but I do think that mentoring young people requires that you do the work of growing in your cultural intelligence, and that is ethnic, racial, socioeconomic, generate all the things, and I think that is a quest and a journey that actually is very exciting. Personally, I love it. So I would hope that those that are listening to this, that are wanting to invest in this next generation, would say, what are the books that I can read, the podcasts I can listen to, the shows that I can watch that will tell me exactly what these people are talking about. And I do that too. I sometimes I don't know what's coming out of their mouths, and I'm like, we literally grew up in the same neighborhood. I have no idea what you're talking about. And so I think that's the biggest challenge for me right now that I see is definitely the youth ministry books and the college ministry books are not written for communities of color, for sure. And I think that if you're doing that work, you will have an adventure ahead of you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sandra, and for taking us into that cultural intelligence, because it is so important. And that's been part of the journey of the Worship Institute staff for the past 3 years or so, all of us together growing in understanding and learning strategies about how to do it better, to engage and really reflect on culture and being together in multiple cultural kinds of communities. So that's really important. I'd like to do one more question, if you could all hang in there with me and close out our time together. So as we conclude this conversation, let's take one more question. So as you consider now those who live on the margins in your communities, how has this approach of multiple pathways helped in breaking down stereotypes or built up trust and built up relationships within your communities? And I guess maybe I hope that has been the case. So, Bo, could we go right back to you?
I'll mention something that Brother Emmett mentioned, proximity, right? Proximity. And, Brian Stevenson, I don't know his name. I mean, he constantly preaches that in such a compelling way. And, just this notion that you will see people differently when you are up close than when you are afar. I know that's a no-brainer, but genuinely true. And that takes time, that takes effort, that takes stepping out of one comfort zone, that takes a different practice, of how we do things. I mean, Sandra touched upon mentorship, and there's a different kind of practice that is required. And by doing this, I've sit in spaces where, I'm the man, right? Because for me, I was professor, I was chaplain, I was this administrator, to be in the room, and and rather than, again, me be in the posture of being defensive, right, it was actually a privilege, right? A privilege to hear, for me to be invited into the space. And and if I could just comment, for those who are viewing, who I know we're talking a lot about those who are sort of in leadership, working with young people, but I'm imagining that there are young people perhaps watching this. You guys are talking about me. I will say this, that just remember, even though your voice may be minoritized, you do have one, right? God has given that to you. And maybe your sphere of influence is not as large as others at this point, but if you provide compelling arguments, people will listen. And so, I'll say, and for those of us who have the mic, to pass it on, right? For us who have the stage, to allow the stage to be populated by others. And just one last word for those who are minoritized and wanting to seek change. And I saw this with my students, because they would be so disappointed that it didn't happen immediately, right? And they were despairing to give up. I think there is a fierce urgency of now, as Dr. King has said, but at the same time, systems, right, by their very nature, right, will take time to change. I mean, and so what I saw at SPU, was that students 1 year protesting, next year ran for student government, And I'm not saying there's one versus the other, okay? But you can do both. You can do both. You can work within institutions and perhaps outside. And if there's any encouragement, I've seen things change, right? I've seen things change, and alumni coming back have seen things change. So just an encouragement for those who are working for change, that it can happen. It may not happen on your watch, right? But you contributed to the next person, in which there was sort of critical mass or some catalytic event, and things changed.
Thanks, Bo. Emmett?
Yeah, I grew up in the margins, and I'm grateful to have had a number of folks who saw in me what I didn't see in myself, and who invested time and energy and all the 5 T's that I gave in me in a way that gave me hope within a sense of hopelessness. I'm a reformed homeboy from Los Angeles, California. Grew up in the quote unquote inner city, and I remember the Rodney King situation, and I grew up, having experienced the SWAT teams, come down, our neighborhood, and the Los Angeles Police Department being corrupt under the leadership of Chief Daryl Gates. The fact that I remember the police chief of my childhood should show you how traumatized I am by that. And so I grew up in the margins, and that gives me a sensitivity to see other people in the margins. And I think what Bo said about institutions, whether it's an institution of higher learning, whether it's an institution of a city, whether it's the institution of the church, whether it's the institutions of the nation, institutions have a interesting challenge because they tend to marginalize people. And it's not always by ethnicity. It's not always by race. It's not always by gender. Sometimes it's by socioeconomic status. The great writer Isabel Wilkerson has just come out with a new book called Caste, and it unveils a different way of looking at American society, where many people have been marginalized based on a caste system, which is not necessarily familiar to folks in the United States, because that's not how we teach US history or civics or social studies. And so many people are marginalized. Even people who don't think they're marginalized are actually marginalized. The great mystic Howard Thurman, I guess he's my theologian of the day, right? Because second time I'm mentioning him, but he wrote a fantastic book called Jesus and the Disinherited. And it's a Christological perspective in terms of how many people don't necessarily see Jesus the same way. And so in that sense, I think it takes a critical, sensitive eye. It also takes humility to be able to engage with somebody who, for many people, you actually may be afraid of. And we don't often talk about that. A lot of our folks, whether clergy or non-clergy, lay leaders or whatnot, are actually afraid of young people, because young people have more access. Young people have more spunk, and young people have a different kind of swag, as they would say, than we did when we were that age. And so it takes a sense of humility to empower somebody who inherently is already powered, who already has that, right? I mean, we grew up where, we had, at least in my home, we had the Encyclopedia Britannica, right? All the volumes on the bookshelf that took up a whole row. And it was almost like, you had to consult the big red book in order to learn something, and if you didn't want to consult the big red book, you had to go to an elder, and they decided whether they were going to tell you, teach you, or send you on a rites of passage to find it out yourself, right? There was all these loops and, obstacles that you had to go through to attain information. Well, these beautiful young people, like I said, have Mama Google and Papa Wikipedia and of course YouTube. And they don't need us in that sense, but it's all uncurated information. And that's where they need us to help them to process. But that's by invitation. And so the marginal piece, even when we think about our local churches, you know, the days of having a youth service, you know, every fifth Sunday is gone. I mean, everybody knows there's only 4 fifth Sundays in the year. I mean, like, so what does that say, right? In the days of, you know, youth participation in your service, you know, either you can sing, you can usher, right? Or, you know, you can help out in the kitchen, right? The days of that stuff is over, you know. Many of our ministries have media ministries. We need to put people in there. Many of us have, you know, graphic design stuff. We need to operationalize these young people. And I would say do it on the way to their faith. Don't wait till they go through your, 101 class and, you know, do it on the way, because that's actually where they experience Christ. And that's where they experience the power of the Holy Spirit. And that's where they get invested in the ministry. So, and I mean the marginalized folks. So the people who don't dress the right way, or the people who don't talk the right way, the people who may not look the right way, you know, put them to work, bring them in, invite them, and show that there's a place for them to not only belong, but as Sandra said, to do, to operationalize, to be active, to participate.
Love that. Do it on the way. Yes. Sandra.
Well, okay, I'll just add a couple things. One is that we know that this generation is the most career and success-driven generation than any other generation before it. So the question we have to ask ourselves as churches and spiritual communities, especially as we think about communities that are quote unquote marginalized or disenfranchised financially and systemically, is what do they need in order to be successful in their vocation and in their career and in their success, whatever they define as success. And what I found in working, I came from a community like that. You know, I obviously am not, now that I have more letters behind my name and, you know, I married financially well and all that kind of, I'm not going to lie, I'm not in that position anymore, but I definitely grew up there. And we live and congregate in a community that is systemically and intentionally disenfranchised. And so we find ourselves in a place asking, like, what do people need? They need access. How did we find our jobs when we were growing up? How did all these people rise to fame at 24 in their company? Because their auntie was the VP of whatever in that company. So we have to think about, how do we think about access within the church? Like, if people want to be mentored, not just like, what does the Bible say about X, Y, Z? You know, can you repeat that scripture back to me? But what does it mean to be a person that is a student of that particular discipline? You're going away to college, the first person in your generation, you're studying engineering. What does it mean to have vocational stewardship? What does it look like to worship God in the way that you study and are in class? You know, those kinds of things that really the church is pretty bad at in general, but I think that maybe we can learn from campus ministries and other spaces that have been doing that longer. I think that's where it matters most. Like, when I read that statistic, I thought, oh my gosh, we've been doing that with university for decades. Maybe like we were onto something, trying to teach students that their jobs actually could make a difference for the gospel, you know? And so I think thinking about what people have access to, the other thing that I came to mind was, you know, the old thing, like, people can't be what they can't see. Mm-hmm. So we need to think about, how are we in our partnership and in our pastoring with those who are disenfranchised or marginalized, and especially as we think about women, we think about, where are the places where they don't see women who are authors, or they don't see women who are preachers, or they don't see women who are CEOs, and how can we bring them into the space to hear their stories and change the narrative? So you hear a Black woman saying, here's how I got my 2 law degrees, and here's what I'm doing here, and I came out, I was in this community, I live down the street here from you guys, and I'm doing this because I love Jesus and I want to see the world change. Like, where is that narrative? And then the third thing I thought of was, you know, a lot of people talk about like coaching and investing and like supporting people from marginalized communities, but there's very little actual championing and kind of patroning, you know, like we need people to get us the funding for the organizations that we're doing, you know, like we already know what we're doing. These, like Bo said earlier, like nobody needs our permission. Like these young leaders in communities of color, they don't need to give our permission to start. They have started, they are leading, and they're leading the people we want to be in our communities. So what would it look like to actually champion them? Like mention their name when they're not in a room, teach them about grants that they can access. And I didn't really have anybody do that for me. And so that's one of the things I'm very committed to as a younger woman of color, that I'm like, did you think about that grant? Did you apply for that foundation? Did you do XYZ? Because it was really my white male friends that told me about those things. And I didn't access them until I was in my 40s. And I wish somebody would have told me when I was 25. So I think, you know, asking what do people need access to, asking what do they need to see, what is the narrative they need to see, and then what does it look like to actually be a champion for them in their vocational and kind of career goals and success. I think that the kids in my community that are 19 and 20 years old, they are brilliant. They are so brilliant. And if what they're doing with no resources financially is better than most of what our institutions are doing with resources, imagine if we partnered with them and supported them and championed them, what they could do to further the message of the gospel, because we were working together instead of apart from one another.
Thank you. Bo, Emmett, Sandra, thanks so much for helping me champion this conversation about youth and multiple pathways. And as we close out this video, to all of our symposium participants, we invite you now to join the conversation by posting in the comments on the webpage. And we want this to be an ongoing conversation now. And we hope you will revisit the page over time to see what others around the globe have added to this very important conversation. Thank you all.